Before this account can properly describe the battle that would finally break the tense standoff this chronicle's third part left unresolved, it needs to describe one final episode from the closing weeks of 1867. An episode that illustrates just how tangled and how personal the violence surrounding the Shinsengumi had become by this point in the story. In the 11th month of 1867, only days after Saken Loma, the figure this account has already credited with helping broker the crucial Satsuma-Choshu alliance, was himself assassinated in Kyoto under circumstances that remain, even today, a subject of genuine historical debate. Suspicion for his killing fell, rightly or wrongly, on the Kishu domain and on a specific official named Miura Kyutaro, who had been publicly associated with anti-Choshu and anti-Satsuma sentiment. Sakamoto's own followers, organized under a trading and paramilitary company he had founded called Kaientai, concluded that Miura bore responsibility for their leader's death and resolved on direct retaliation. Miura, aware of the danger he faced, requested and received protection from the Shinsengumi, and it was Saito Hajime, along with several other Shinsengumi swordsmen, who took up positions guarding him at an inn called Tenmaya in Kyoto in the middle of the 12th month. The Kaientai attackers struck on the night of the 7th day of that month, in an assault remembered as the Tenmayajiken, the Tenmaya incident, fighting Shinsengumi guards in close combat within the inn's rooms in a confrontation that, while smaller in scale than the Ikedaya raid 3.5 years earlier, followed a genuinely similar pattern. Close quarters swordsmanship in a cramped commercial building, fought by lamplight, between men whose underlying political grievances had, by this stage of the larger conflict, become almost impossible to fully untangle from simple, direct cycles of personal revenge. Miura survived the attack, protected successfully by Saito and his fellow guards, though several men on both sides were wounded or killed in the fighting. This account mentions this episode not for its own historical weight, which was genuinely modest compared to the battle this chronicle must turn to next, but because it captures, with particular clarity, the atmosphere prevailing in Kyoto during these final days before 1867 gave way to 1868. A city where assassination, counter-assassination, and paid protection against further retaliation had become so woven into the ordinary fabric of political life that a domain official could reasonably expect to need swordsmen guarding his lodging simply to survive an ordinary evening. It was into this atmosphere, tense, violent, and thick with the accumulated grievances of nearly 5 years of exactly this kind of cyclical bloodshed, that the formal, large-scale warfare this chronicle has been building toward finally arrived in the first days of January 1868, when forces loyal to former shogun Yoshinobu, advancing from Osaka toward Kyoto, encountered the new imperial government's Satsuma and Choshu forces at the towns of Toba and Fushimi, and opened fire. The battle that finally broke 5 years of mounting tension between the shogunate's supporters and the imperial restoration movement began on the 3rd day of the 1st month, 1868, along the 2 main roads leading from Osaka into Kyoto, near the towns of Toba and Fushimi, and it is remembered ever since simply as Toba Fushimi no Tatakai, the Battle of Toba Fushimi. The immediate circumstances leading to the outbreak of actual fighting involved former shogun Yoshinobu's decision, after weeks of increasingly tense negotiation over the new provisional government's demands regarding Tokugawa land holdings, to advance a force from Osaka toward Kyoto, ostensibly to present a formal protest regarding these demands directly to the imperial court, but backed by a genuinely substantial military force that included Aizu and Kuwana domain troops, alongside the Shinsengumi itself. When this advancing force reached the checkpoints controlling the roads into Kyoto at Toba and Fushimi, Satsuma troops stationed there refused to allow passage, and, After a tense standoff whose precise triggering moment remains somewhat disputed among different contemporary accounts, opened fire on the approaching column. What followed was 3 days of genuine sustained combat, fought with organised infantry formations, artillery and firearms on both sides. A scale and intensity of warfare considerably beyond anything the Shinsengumi itself had previously experienced, even accounting for the Kinmon incident this account has already described in some detail. The Shinsengumi fought at Fushimi specifically, engaging Satsuma and allied imperial forces in combat around the town's magistrate's office and the surrounding streets. Bringing to this considerably larger and more technologically modern battlefield the same close-quarters swordsmanship that had served the organisation so well in Kyoto's narrow alleys and cramped-in rooms. This account has already suggested in its earlier sections why this particular combination of skills would prove increasingly inadequate against a genuinely modern military opponent. And the fighting at Fushimi confirmed this pattern with brutal clarity. Satsuma and Choshu forces, considerably smaller in raw numbers than the combined shogunate-aligned force arrayed against them, possessed a decisive advantage in modern rifles and artillery, weapons that had been deliberately and systematically acquired and mastered over the preceding several years, precisely because both domains' own increasingly radical political trajectories had pushed them towards serious engagement with Western military methods in a way the more institutionally conservative shogunate military establishment had never fully matched. Shinsengumi, swordsman, charging toward entrenched positions defended by organised rifle fire, suffered heavy casualties in exchanges where individual swordsmanship, however extraordinary, offered essentially no meaningful counter to concentrated firearms fire delivered from a prepared defensive position. The battle's outcome was decided, in a sense that extended well beyond its immediate tactical results, on its second day, when Imperial forces raised a specific and highly symbolic banner, a brocade banner, Nishiki no Mihata, understood throughout Japan as a physical symbol carrying the emperor's own direct authority and sanction. The raising of this banner instantly transformed the political character of the entire conflict. Forces fighting against an army marching under this banner were, by this act alone, redefined, in the eyes of nearly everyone watching across the country, not as participants in a contested political struggle between rival factions, but as enemies of the throne itself, a status carrying implications that reached far beyond the immediate battlefield. This account has already noted, in its second part's discussion of the broader Sono-Joi political current, just how deeply reverence for the emperor's authority ran, even among men whose actual political sympathies lay with the shogunate, rather than with the imperial restoration movement specifically. The brocade banner's appearance struck directly at this underlying reverence, and its effect was immediate and severe. Several domains, whose loyalties had remained genuinely uncertain throughout the preceding tense standoff, abandoned the shogunate's cause within days, unwilling to fight, or to be seen fighting, against a force now carrying explicit imperial sanction, regardless of whatever formal, legal, or political arguments Yoshinobu's own supporters might have continued to offer regarding the legitimacy of their position. For Kondo Isami, still operating with diminished capacity from his Fushimi ambush wound only weeks earlier, and for Hijikata Toshizo, who bore an increasing share of the Shinsengumi's actual battlefield command during this engagement, the battle's rapid deterioration into a decisive and comprehensive defeat represented something this account believes deserves to be stated plainly. The first unambiguous military confirmation that the cause they had built their entire adult identities around defending was not merely facing a difficult political challenge, but was, in the most direct and immediate sense, actually losing an open war against an opponent whose combination of modern weaponry and unimpeachable political legitimacy, the Shinsengumi's own particular combination of swordsmanship and personal loyalty, simply could not overcome. By the battle's third day, shogunate-aligned forces were in general retreat, falling back first toward Osaka and, within days, well beyond it, as Yoshinobu himself made a decision that stunned and, for many of his most loyal supporters, deeply embittered even those who had fought hardest on his behalf. Rather than continuing to lead the resistance from Osaka Castle, where substantial shogunate-aligned forces still remained in a genuinely defensible position, Yoshinobu boarded a ship in the middle of the night and sailed for Edo, leaving his own army behind, essentially without its commander, to absorb the full consequences of the defeat that had just occurred. This account will have more to say in its following sections about the practical and emotional consequences of Yoshinobu's departure for the men who had fought and bled at Toba Fushimi on his behalf. This account's larger subjects, Kondo and Hijikata, prominent among them. For now, it is enough to note that the battle whose outcome would determine, in the space of only 3 days, the fate of everything this account's first 3 parts spent so long building toward, had ended in a defeat considerably more comprehensive and considerably more consequential than anyone on the shogunate side had genuinely anticipated when the fighting first broke out along the roads at Toba and Fushimi. Yoshinobu's departure from Osaka, described at the close of this account's previous section, left the shogunate-aligned forces still gathered there in a genuinely difficult position, uncertain whether to continue resistance from Osaka Castle, still a formidable defensive position with substantial remaining troops and supplies, or to follow their nominal commander's own example and withdraw entirely. In practice, with their supreme commander already gone and with morale severely damaged by the unexpected and comprehensive defeat at Toba Fushimi, compounded by the psychological impact of the imperial brocade banner this account has already described, organized resistance from Osaka collapsed within days. The Shinsengumi, along with the remnants of Aizu's forces and other shogunate loyalists, retreated first within Osaka itself and then, following Yoshinobu's own path, took ship for Edo, arriving in the shogunal capital in a state that several surviving accounts describe in terms considerably closer to a defeated, disorganized remnant than to a fighting force that had, only weeks earlier, still believed itself capable of prevailing in open conflict. Kondo Isami, still recovering from his Fushimi wound and now compounded by the physical and psychological toll of the Toba Fushimi defeat itself, returned to Edo in considerably diminished condition, both physically and, by several accounts, in terms of the confident authority that had defined his leadership since the organization's earliest days in Mibu. Hijikata Toshizo, whose own physical condition remained comparatively unimpaired, bore an increasing share of the practical burden of managing what remained of the organization's structure and morale during this difficult return. Okita Soji, whose declining health this account has already traced back to the possible symptoms he displayed during the Ikedanya raid nearly 4 years earlier, had, by the time of the retreat to Edo, deteriorated to a point where he was no longer capable of meaningful participation in active combat. He was placed under the care of a physician sympathetic to the organization, confined increasingly to bed, coughing with a severity that left little doubt to those around him about the seriousness of his condition, even as the broader military and political crisis engulfing everyone he had ever served alongside continued to accelerate around him. The Edo that these defeated forces returned to in the early months of 1868 was itself a city gripped by genuine uncertainty and genuine fear. Word of the Toba Fushimi defeat and of the imperial government's brocade banner effectively declaring the Tokugawa house and its remaining supporters enemies of the throne had already reached the capital, and the question facing every remaining shogunate loyalist, from Yoshinobu himself down to the lowest-ranking Shinsengumi recruit, was no longer how to win the broader conflict, but simply whether and how, and for how much longer, any organized resistance could continue at all. Yoshinobu himself, in Edo, adopted a posture of formal submission to the new imperial government, retiring from active political life and placing himself under a form of house confinement, a decision that reflected his own apparent judgment that continued resistance offered no realistic prospect of success and risked only further, ultimately pointless bloodshed and the potential complete destruction of the Tokugawa house itself. This decision left men like Kondo and Hijikata, whose entire adult identities had been built around personal loyalty to Yoshinobu specifically, in a genuinely difficult position. Their nominal lord had, in effect, instructed his own most loyal supporters to stand down, even as many of those supporters, the Shinsengumi, prominent among them, remained unwilling to simply abandon the cause they had given so much to defend. Kondo, attempting to salvage some continued purpose for his diminished and demoralized organization amid this genuinely confusing political situation, sought and received permission to reorganize his remaining forces under a new name and a new formal mandate. A reorganization, this account's following section will describe, that would carry the organization, now renamed and restructured, into one final campaign, fought not in the familiar streets of Kyoto, but in the mountainous countryside of Kai province, west of Edo, in an engagement whose outcome would prove decisive not for the broader war, which was by this point already effectively lost, but for Kondo's own personal authority and standing among the men who still, however uncertainly, continued to follow him. The reorganization Kondo Isami pursued in the weeks following the Shinsengumi's return to Edo carried a new name, one that reflected the specific mission he had secured formal shogunate permission to undertake: Koyo Chimbutai. The Koyo Pacification Corps, tasked with securing Kai province, roughly corresponding to the modern Yamanashi region west of Edo, and its strategically important castle town of Kofu, against the advancing imperial forces that were, by this point in early 1868, moving steadily eastward from the Kyoto region toward Edo itself. This mission carried genuine strategic logic. Kofu Castle occupied an important position along one of the main routes toward Edo, and securing it, in theory, could help slow the imperial army's advance and buy time for whatever broader resistance strategy the remaining shogunate loyalists might still be able to organize. Kondo, whatever his diminished physical condition, appears to have approached this new command with genuine determination, perhaps seeing in it an opportunity to demonstrate that his organization, despite its recent defeat, remained capable of meaningful service to the cause it had spent 5 years defending. The reality of the campaign, however, fell considerably short of this hope, undermined from its earliest stages by problems that reflected the broader disarray afflicting the entire shogunate loyalist cause during this period. Promised reinforcements and supplies failed to fully materialize. The march toward Kofu proceeded more slowly than originally planned, delayed in part, according to several accounts, by Kondo's own insistence on stopping in his home region near Edo to visit family and former associates. A decision that, whatever its personal significance to a man who must have understood at some level how uncertain his own future had become, cost the expedition crucial time. That delay proved decisive. When Kondo's forces finally approached Kofu, they discovered that imperial forces, moving with considerably greater speed and considerably better coordination, had already occupied the castle town ahead of them, transforming what Kondo had hoped would be a defensive stronghold into, instead, an enemy position his own diminished and poorly supplied force would now have to attack. The resulting engagement, fought in the town of Katsunuma in the 3rd month of 1868, proved a swift and comprehensive defeat for Kondo's forces. Imperial troops, better armed, better supplied, and considerably more numerous than the depleted Koyo Chimbutai that Kondo had managed to field, routed his forces with relative ease, forcing a disorganized retreat back toward Edo that bore little resemblance to the disciplined, effective military operations that had once made the Shinsengumi's name so feared throughout Kyoto. This defeat carried consequences that extended well beyond its immediate tactical significance, striking directly at Kondo's own personal authority within what remained of his organization. Several of his most senior and most experienced officers, men who had served alongside him since the organization's earliest days, began, in the defeat's immediate aftermath, to openly question his continued fitness for command. A questioning that reflected not merely disappointment over a single lost battle, but a broader, accumulating concern about Kondo's judgment during a period when the entire cause he represented was collapsing around him with increasing speed. Among those voicing this concern most directly were two men whose stories this account has followed closely since its very opening sections: Nagakura Shinpachi and Harada Sanosuke. Both men, according to the most reliable surviving accounts, grew convinced, in the weeks following the Katsunuma defeat, that Kondo's continued autocratic style of command, a style that had perhaps suited the organization's earlier years, but that seemed increasingly disconnected from the desperate practical realities the organization now faced, was no longer serving the interests of the men who remained under his authority. This disagreement culminated in an actual formal split, Nagakura and Harada departing Kondo's command to form their own separate unit, eventually organized under a name this account will introduce in its following sections, taking with them a number of other veteran Shinsengumi members who shared their assessment that continued service under Kondo's specific leadership no longer represented the best path forward for men still committed to the moment. Broader shogunate loyalist cause, even as they had lost confidence in the particular commander who had led them for the past 5 years. This account wants to sit, briefly, with the genuine poignancy of this moment. Nagakura, whose own later memoirs form one of the single most valuable sources this account has drawn upon throughout its entire chronicle, had trained alongside Kondo since their earliest days together at the Shiekan, had fought beside him at the Ikadaya, had remained loyal through years of increasingly difficult circumstances. That this same man, in the final desperate months of the organization's existence, concluded that he could no longer continue serving under Kondo's direct command represents, in this account's assessment, one of the clearest available signals of just how completely the confidence and cohesion that had once defined this organization had eroded under the accumulated weight of military defeat, political collapse, and the sheer physical and psychological exhaustion of 5 years spent almost constantly under threat of violent death. Kondo Isami. Following the Katsunuma defeat and the painful split with Nagakura Shinpachi and Harada Sanosuke, this account's previous section has just described, retreated with his remaining loyal followers to a town called Nagareyama, north of Edo, hoping to regroup, gather what supplies and reinforcements might still be available, and continue organized resistance from a position somewhat removed from the increasingly precarious situation in Edo itself. It was at Nagareyama, in the 4th month of 1868, that Kondo's own personal story and his direct command of the organization he had built from nothing over the preceding 5 years came to its end. Imperial forces tracking the movements of remaining shogunate loyalists in the regions surrounding Edo located Kondo's position and approached, initially under the guise of formal negotiation rather than immediate attack. Kondo, whether hoping there remained some genuine room for negotiated settlement or simply lacking better practical options given his diminished forces and diminished physical condition, agreed to meet with the imperial representatives, travelling under an assumed identity in an attempt to avoid immediate recognition. This attempt at concealment failed, and the specific manner of its failure carries a bitter irony. This account has already flagged in its earlier sections. Kondo was identified by a former Shinsengumi associate now serving with the imperial forces, a man who had once called him a comrade. This account cannot claim full certainty about every detail of exactly how this recognition occurred, since the surviving accounts vary somewhat in their specifics. But the broader pattern they describe is consistent and, in its own way, thematically resonant with everything this chronicle has already traced. an organization that had built so much of its own internal history around the swift, decisive elimination of internal betrayal. From Serizawa Kamo through Sannan Keisuke, through Ito Kashitaro, found its own final undoing, arriving through precisely the kind of former comrade turned informant dynamic it had spent 5 years trying to prevent within its own ranks. Kondo was taken into custody. Hijikata Toshizo, who had been away from Nagareyama at the time, gathering additional reinforcements and supplies, returned to find his oldest friend and longtime commanding officer already gone, and spent the following weeks in an increasingly desperate and ultimately entirely unsuccessful effort to negotiate his release. Appealing to whatever remaining shogunate contacts and whatever remaining personal influence he could still call upon, in a political landscape that had, by this point, moved almost entirely beyond the reach of such appeals. The imperial government, and Satsuma's leadership in particular, had their own clear and considered reasons for wanting Kondo dead rather than released, reasons that extended well beyond simple military necessity. He had become, over the preceding 5 years, one of the most immediately recognizable symbols of shogunate resistance in the entire country. The commander whose name was directly attached to the Ikadaya incident, to years of killings carried out against imperial loyalists in Kyoto's own streets. Killings that had claimed the lives of men whose own comrades and former associates now held genuine influence within the new government taking shape. His death would serve simultaneously as punishment, as practical elimination of a still symbolically dangerous figure, and as an unmistakable warning to any remaining shogunate loyalists still contemplating continued resistance. In a way, his continued imprisonment, however secure, could never quite achieve with the same finality. Kondo Isami was held for several weeks following his capture at Nagareyama, transferred eventually to Itabashi, on Edo's northern outskirts, where the imperial government maintained him under guard while the question of his ultimate fate was settled among the new government's leadership. The decision, when it came, denied Kondo the death that a man of his formal samurai status might, under different circumstances, have expected. Rather than seppuku, the ritual suicide this account has already described at length in its discussion of the Shinsengumi's own internal disciplinary practices, Kondo was sentenced to execution by beheading, a method traditionally reserved for common criminals rather than for warriors, a final, deliberate humiliation inflicted on a man who had spent the entire final chapter of his life working to prove that his own obscure, non-samurai origins did not disqualify him from being treated as a genuine member of the warrior class he had fought so hard to join. The execution was carried out on the 25th day of the 4th month, 1868, at Itabashi. Facing his death, by every surviving account of witnesses present, with the same composed dignity that this account has already described, Sannan displaying under similar circumstances 3 years earlier. Whether Kondo, in his final days, fully understood that the cause he had given absolutely everything to defend was already, by any realistic practical assessment, entirely lost, the surviving sources do not clearly indicate. What they do indicate, consistently, is that he did not attempt to flee, did not attempt to disguise the depth of his own commitment to the cause that had brought him to this end, and went to his death according to the same code of unwavering loyalty that had defined his entire adult life. A code that had, by 1868, become almost completely obsolete within the rapidly modernizing political world actually taking shape around him. His head, following the execution, was displayed publicly, first in Edo, and then, according to several accounts, transported to Kyoto for further public display, a practice with deep roots in Japanese warfare, intended to demonstrate, beyond any possible remaining doubt, that the shogunate's most feared and most effective enforcer in Kyoto's own streets was now, finally and unambiguously, dead. Kondo was 44 years old. He had grown up the adopted son of a small, entirely unfashionable rural dojo, had trained with a relentlessness that exceeded nearly everyone around him, precisely because relentless effort was the only genuine advantage available to a man of his humble origins, and had spent the final 5 years of his life rising through nothing but demonstrated skill, genuine leadership capacity, and an old-fashioned, ultimately unshakable commitment to loyalty as a value worth any cost, to a rank that placed him formally among the shogun's own closest retainers, before dying, in the end, the death legally reserved for common criminals, in service to a government that had, in every practical sense, already ceased to exist by the time his captors finally caught up with him. Okitasoji did not live to learn the specific details of Kondo Isami's execution, or he learned them, if he learned them at all, only in the final and most severely weakened days of his own life, confined by this point almost entirely to the sickbed, where the physicians sympathetic to the organization's cause had been caring for him since the retreat from Osaka. The tuberculosis that had, this account has already suggested, likely first announced itself during the Ikadaya fighting nearly 4 years earlier, had, by the spring of 1868, progressed to a stage that left little room for any remaining hope of recovery. He was, by this point, coughing blood regularly, too weak to leave his bed, entirely unable to participate in any of the military campaigns and political dramas this account's recent sections have described unfolding around him. From the Toba Fushimi defeat, through the Koshu Katsunuma campaign, through Kondo's own capture and execution. There is a story about Okuta's final weeks, repeated often enough across later accounts that it has become a genuinely persistent part of how he is remembered. Though this account, in keeping with its established commitment to honesty about the limits of what can be fully verified, cannot claim complete certainty about its precise accuracy. That in his final period of illness, too weak for any more active engagement with the world around him, he would sit near a window and watch a black cat that regularly visited the small garden outside, taking quiet, simple pleasure in something as modest and as ordinary as an animal passing through in the afternoon light. Whether this specific detail is precisely accurate or not, it captures something that seems, from the broader pattern of surviving testimony about him, to have been genuinely characteristic. Even at the very end of his life, after years spent as one of the most feared and most lethally effective swordsmen in all of Kyoto, those who remembered him consistently described a person who retained, until the last, an unusual gentleness, a capacity for small, simple happiness that his violent occupation had never fully displaced. Okitasoji died in Edo in the 5th month of 1868, only weeks after Kondo's own execution at nearby Itabashi, in the same general season when the humid, early summer weather settling over the city would have carried at least a faint echo of the same oppressive summer heat that had filled the air on the night of the Ikadaya raid. 4 years earlier, when his own extraordinary skill had first announced itself so dramatically to the wider world. In the same fight that most historians now believe marked the first visible appearance of the illness that had, finally, ended his life. He was 25 years old, or perhaps 27, the precise year of his birth never having been recorded with full certainty. One among the many small uncertainties that surround even the most celebrated figures from this particular period. When record-keeping for a farmer's grandson or a small dojo's star pupil was rarely conducted with the same careful precision reserved for men of higher birth. He did not live to see the final battles at Aizu, or the desperate winter campaign that would eventually carry Hijikata Toshizo to the northern island of Ezo, or Hijikata's own death at Goryokaku the following spring. He had already, by the time those events unfolded, been gone for nearly a year, remembered by the men still fighting on in his absence as the young swordsman whose extraordinary skill none of them had ever quite managed to match, and whose easy laughter, those who had known him longest still insisted, had been just as memorable, in its own quieter way, as anything he had ever done with a blade in his hand. This account left Nagakura Shinpachi and Harada Sanosuke in its fourth section, having just formally separated from Kondo's direct command in the wake of the Koshu Katsunuma defeat, convinced that his continued leadership no longer served the practical interests of the men still committed to continued resistance. It is worth following their own path forward now because it diverges, in genuinely significant ways, from the path this account has just finished tracing, through Kondo's capture and execution and Okuta's quiet death in Edo. Nagakura and Harada, along with the veteran Shinsengumi members, who chose to follow them rather than remain under Kondo's continued command, organized themselves into a new unit they called Seiheitai, and continued, independently of Kondo's own remaining forces, to participate in the broader shogunate loyalist resistance as it shifted, over the following months, further north, toward the territory around Aizu and the surrounding domains that remained committed to continued fighting, even as Edo itself, and much of central Japan, settled into acceptance of the new imperial government's authority. This account has already described, in its earlier sections, the specific character of Aizu's own commitment to the shogunate's cause, rooted in centuries-old family obligations that Matsudaira Katamori's own domain had never treated as merely convenient political alignment. As the broader war continued through the summer of 1868, Aizu became the natural rallying point for shogunate loyalists throughout the region, who were unwilling to accept the settlement Edo itself had reached. And Seiheitai, under Nagakura and Harada's joint leadership, made its way north to join this continued resistance, fighting in engagements around Nikko and Utsunomiya as imperial forces pressed steadily northward through the summer months. It is worth noting here something this account finds genuinely significant about Nagakura's own trajectory during this period, because it complicates any simple narrative of straightforward, unwavering loyalty this chronicle might otherwise be tempted to construct. Nagakura had trained alongside Kondo since their earliest shared days at the Shiekan. He had fought beside him at the Ikedaya, had remained loyal through years of increasingly difficult circumstances. And yet, when Kondo's own judgment and continued fitness for command came into genuine question during the organization's final desperate months, Nagakura proved willing to break from him, not out of any failure of underlying commitment to the broader shogunate loyalist cause, but out of a considered, independent judgment that continued service, specifically under Kondo, no longer represented the best path forward. This account believes this distinction matters and is worth holding alongside everything it has already said about loyalty and makoto, sincerity, as this larger chronicle's central organizing themes. Nagakura's break with Kondo was not a betrayal of the underlying cause both men had given years of their lives to. It was, if anything, a demonstration that genuine loyalty to a cause and unconditional personal loyalty to a specific individual leader are not always, in practice, the same thing, and that a man could remain genuinely committed to the broader fight, as Nagakura plainly did, continuing to serve in Seiheitai through difficult northern campaigns for months after his split from Kondo, while still exercising independent judgment about which specific leadership he believed capable of carrying that fight forward effectively. There is a third path this account needs to trace through these final chaotic months, distinct from both Kondo's own tragic trajectory toward Itabashi and Nagakura's independent decision to break away and continue the fight under his own separate command. The path chosen by Saito Hajime, whose earlier service this account has already followed through the 3rd Squad's command and through his role defending Miura Kyutaro at the Tenma Yajiken. Saito, unlike Nagakura and Harada, did not break from the organization's continued northward retreat. And unlike Kondo, he was not captured and executed. Instead, as the remnants of the Shinsengumi now increasingly merged into the broader coalition of shogunate loyalist forces gathering around Aizu, made their way north through the summer of 1868. Saito made a choice that several later accounts describe in terms suggesting a degree of personal conviction, distinct from simple continued obedience to organizational command. He committed himself, specifically and personally, to Aizu's own defense, reportedly stating, in words later accounts have preserved in something close to their original form, that he intended to share Aizu's fate to the very end, living or dying alongside the domain, rather than continuing to operate as part of whatever remained of the Shinsengumi's own separate organizational identity. This account finds something worth pausing on in this specific choice, because it represents a third distinct model of loyalty, alongside Kondo's unwavering personal commitment to Yoshinobu and the broader Tokugawa cause, and Nagakura's more independent cause-focused commitment that proved willing to separate from a specific failing leader while remaining loyal to the broader fight. Saito's choice bound him not to a person, and not quite to an abstract cause either, but to a specific place and a specific community. Aizu itself, the domain whose sponsorship had made the Shinsengumi's entire existence possible in the first place, back in 1863, and whose own particular, deeply rooted tradition of loyalty this account has already described at some length in its earlier sections. This choice would carry Saito through the siege of Aizu's own castle at Wakamatsu, an engagement this account's following sections must now describe. One of the most sustained and most brutal engagements of the entire Boshin War, and would ultimately allow him, unlike so many of the other men whose stories this account has followed, to survive the war's conclusion entirely, going on in the decades that followed to build the long, quiet, later life this account's final part will eventually need to describe. A life that included, in one of the more genuinely remarkable turns this entire chronicle has to offer, eventual service within the new imperial government's own police force, the very kind of institution his younger self had spent 5 years fighting against. For now, though, in the summer of 1868, Saito remained simply what he had chosen to be, a swordsman who had decided, amid the general collapse of everything the Shinsengumi had once represented, that his own personal loyalty belonged to Aizu specifically, and who was prepared to see that particular commitment through to whatever end it demanded of him, a commitment that would soon be tested against the full weight of the Imperial Army's advance into Aizu's own mountainous home territory. By the summer of 1868, the broader conflict this account has been tracing since its opening description of the crisis following Commodore Perry's arrival in 1853 had narrowed, in practical terms, to a single remaining question: whether Aizu and the small coalition of domains still committed to continued resistance could hold out against an imperial army that had already secured, in one form or another, the submission or active cooperation of nearly every other major domain in the country. This conflict, encompassing the Toba-Fushimi battle this account has already described, along with the extended northern campaign this section now introduces, is remembered, taken as a whole, as the Boshin Senso, the Boshin War, named for the specific year, in the traditional sexagenary calendar cycle in which it began. Aizu had, since Matsudaira Katamori's original appointment as Kyoto's military commissioner back in 1862, an appointment this account described in its very first part, remained perhaps the single most consistently and most sincerely committed of all the shogunate's supporting domains. And it was Aizu, more than any other single domain, that now bore the brunt of the imperial government's determination to complete its military victory, beyond simply securing Edo's own formal submission. Imperial forces advanced into the mountainous terrain surrounding Aizu's home territory through the summer months of 1868, meeting fierce and often genuinely desperate resistance from Aizu's own forces and from the remaining shogunate loyalists. Hijikata Toshizo and his remaining Shinsengumi contingent, Saito Hajime and his personally chosen commitment to Aizu's cause, and numerous other scattered groups, who had gathered to make what many of them, by this point, must have understood was likely to be their final organised stand. This account's fifth and final part will need to describe, in full, the siege of Aizu's own castle at Wakamatsu that followed, one of the most sustained and most costly engagements of the entire Boshin War. An engagement whose casualties included, according to well-documented accounts, even very young domain retainers, boys barely into their teenage years, fighting and, in several documented instances, taking their own lives rather than accept their domain's eventual and, by autumn, entirely unavoidable defeat. For Hijikata specifically, the retreat toward Aizu and the fighting that awaited him there marked the beginning of what would become his own final campaign, a campaign that would carry him, over the following 10 months, from the mountains surrounding Aizu, through a further retreat to Sendai, across the sea to the northern island of Ezo, and finally to a fortress called Goryokaku, near the town of Hakodate, where this account's final part must eventually bring his own remarkable story, and this larger chronicles account of the Shinsengumi as an organised fighting force to its actual historical conclusion. Let us pause here, partway through this account's fourth part, and take stock of how completely the world this chronicle opened with, a column of hopeful, inexperienced men walking a spring road from Edo toward Kyoto in 1863, had come apart by the middle of 1868. Kondo Isami, the plain-faced dojo instructor whose relentless discipline had built an organization out of nothing, was dead, executed as a common criminal at Itabashi. Okita Soji, the gentle, extraordinarily gifted young swordsman whose skill none of his comrades had ever quite matched, was dead as well, claimed not by any enemy's blade, but by an illness that had likely been growing within him since the very night that first made his organization famous. The organization itself had fractured into at least 3 distinct parts. Hijikata Toshizo still fighting under the Shinsengumi's own name as it retreated toward Aizu, Nagakura Shinpachi and Harada Sanosuke, continuing the fight under their own independent command in Seiheitai and Saito Hajime, having bound his own personal loyalty specifically to Aizu itself, rather than to any individual leader or even to the Shinsengumi's own institutional identity. This account has tried, throughout the story so far, to resist the temptation to flatten this fracturing into a simple story of betrayal or collapse, because the actual historical record it has drawn upon suggests something more genuinely complicated. 3 different men, each of whom had given years of his life to the same original cause, reaching 3 different conclusions about how that commitment ought to be honoured once the organisation's original leadership and original circumstances had themselves become impossible to sustain. What remained constant across all 3 of these diverging paths was the underlying commitment this account identified in its very first section as this entire chronicle's central organising thread. Makoto, sincerity, the insistence that a promise once made deserved to be honoured, in whatever specific form each man now judged best, regardless of how completely the political world that had originally given that promise its meaning had already collapsed around them. This account must now follow these diverging paths to their actual historical conclusions. The siege of Aizu's own castle and Saito's role within it, the long retreat north that awaited Hijikata, first to Sendai and then across the sea to Ezo, and the eventual fates, considerably later in life and considerably more peaceful in their circumstances, of Nagakura and Saito both. Men who, unlike Kondo and Okta, would live long enough to watch the Japan they had once fought so hard against fully take shape, and who would, in Nagakura's case specifically, eventually help ensure that the story this account has spent so long telling would not simply disappear along with the world that had originally produced it. The siege of Aizu's own castle at Wakamatsu Wakamatsujo, sometimes called Tsurugajo, the Castle of the Cranes, began in earnest in the autumn of 1868. After months of fighting across the surrounding mountain passes and river valleys, had gradually worn down the coalition of domains, still resisting the imperial government's advance, leaving Aizu itself, by late summer, increasingly isolated and increasingly dependent on its own resources alone. This account has already noted the particular intensity and the particular human cost of this engagement, including the well-documented participation of very young domain retainers, boys organised into a unit remembered as the Byakutai, the White Tiger Corps, some as young as 13 or 14, who fought in the battles surrounding the castle and who, in one of the war's most sorrowful and most frequently retold episodes, mistakenly believed, watching smoke rising over the castle from a nearby hillside, that the fortress had already fallen, and chose, rather than accept what they understood as their domain's final defeat, to take their own lives together on that hillside, a mistaken belief, since the castle had not yet actually fallen, that gives this particular tragedy an additional and genuinely difficult layer of pathos that Japanese historical memory has carried forward ever since. Saito Hajime, whose personal commitment specifically to Aizu's own cause this account's previous part has already described, fought throughout this siege with the same disciplined effectiveness that had defined his entire Shinsengumi career, serving alongside Aizu's own retainers rather than as part of any separate outside contingent. A choice that reflected, this account believes, the genuine sincerity of the specific commitment he had made. The siege itself lasted approximately 1 month, Aizu's defenders holding out against Imperial artillery bombardment and repeated assaults, with the determination that even the Imperial forces themselves, by several surviving accounts, came to regard with genuine respect before the castle's ultimate surrender, negotiated by Aizu's own leadership, once further resistance had become clearly and unambiguously hopeless, brought the siege to its conclusion in the final weeks of 1868. Aizu's formal surrender did not mean the end of Saito's own personal war, though it did mean the end of the specific commitment to Aizu itself that had carried him through the siege. In the surrender's aftermath, he made his way, along with other scattered remnants of the shogunate loyalist coalition, further north, eventually reaching territory still under the nominal authority of the remaining resistance, continuing, in whatever capacity remained available to him, a fight that had, by this point, been reduced to its final, narrowing theatre, the northern island of Ezo, where a coalition of former shogunate naval officers and remaining loyalists, under the leadership of a figure this account must now properly introduce, Enomoto Takeaki, had begun organising what would become the war's final chapter. Aizu's own fate following its surrender deserves a moment of this account's attention before moving on, because it illustrates the genuinely severe cost that this particular domain's unwavering loyalty ultimately exacted from its own people. The domain was formally dissolved, its territory confiscated by the new imperial government, and its surviving population subjected, in the years that followed, to a degree of continued punishment and continued hardship that distinguished Aizu's post-war treatment from the considerably gentler settlements many other former shogunate-aligned domains received. Aizu's own retainers and their families were, in many documented cases, relocated to considerably harsher, less productive territory in the country's far north, a punishment for having remained loyal to the very end, to a cause that the rest of the country had already, by 1868, largely concluded was worth abandoning. This account has already suggested in its earlier sections that Aizu's particular brand of old-fashioned, deeply sincere loyalty to the shogunate was not so different in its basic underlying character from the Shinsengumi's own defining commitment to makoto, sincerity, as an organising value. Aizu's post-war suffering, considerably more severe and considerably more prolonged than the fate of most other former shogunate loyalist domains, stands as a sobering reminder of what that particular kind of unwavering commitment could actually cost. Not merely the individual men who fought and died in its name, but an entire domain's population, for a full generation and more, after the fighting itself had finally ended. While Aizu's own siege was still underway, Hijikata Toshizo, recognizing that the domain's position had become increasingly untenable, made his way north to Sendai, another domain that had participated in the broader shogunate loyalist coalition, hoping to find there the resources and the continued organizational structure needed to keep the fight alive, even as Aizu's own resistance approached its inevitable end. It was at Sendai that Hijikata's path converged with that of Enomoto Takeaki, a former shogunate naval officer who had studied in the Netherlands and who commanded a genuinely significant portion of the former shogunate's own modern naval fleet. A fleet that Enomoto had refused to surrender to the new imperial government, despite Edo's own formal capitulation earlier that year, sailing instead for the north with several thousand loyal officers, sailors and soldiers, determined to continue the fight from whatever territory remained beyond the imperial government's immediate reach. This convergence between Hijikata's own considerable experience commanding disciplined infantry forces and Enomoto's naval capability and access to modern weaponry and supplies produced, by the closing weeks of 1868, a coalition genuinely more formidable than the scattered, exhausted remnants either man might have commanded independently. Together, they resolved to sail for Ezochi, the northern island that would later, under the new Meiji government's administration, be renamed Hokkaido, territory that lay, at this point in Japanese history, only partially under any government's effective administrative control, populated substantially by the indigenous Ainu people, alongside a comparatively modest number of Japanese settlers, and possessing, crucially, a genuinely defensible fortress that Enomoto's own faction had specifically identified as a viable base for continued resistance. That fortress was Goryokaku, a star-shaped fortification near the port town of Hakodate, built only a few years earlier under the shogunate's own direction. Using European-influenced military architectural principles specifically intended to provide superior defensive capability against the kind of modern artillery bombardment that traditional Japanese castle design, however impressive in its own aesthetic and historical terms, was increasingly ill-equipped to withstand. Hijikata Saito Hajime, having by this point also made his way north to join this gathering coalition, along with the remaining loyal Shinsengumi contingent and the broader body of shogunate loyalists that Enomoto's leadership had assembled, sailed from Sendai in the 10th month of 1868, landing on Ezo's coast and beginning, over the following weeks, a campaign to secure the island's key positions, including Goryokaku itself and the surrounding territory around Hakodate, against the comparatively modest imperial government forces then present on the island. This campaign succeeded with a degree of relative ease that must have provided at least some genuine encouragement to men who had, over the preceding year, experienced almost nothing but retreat and defeat. By the close of 1868, Enomoto's coalition controlled the great majority of Ezo's southern territory, and, in a step that reflected both genuine political ambition and a considered assessment of what durable governance in this newly secured territory might actually require, the coalition's leadership organised a formal government, complete with an electoral process among its own senior officers to select its leadership, an arrangement remembered ever since as the Ezo Kyowakoku, the Ezo Republic, sometimes described, with a degree of retrospective significance that its own founders likely could not have fully appreciated at the time, as one of Asia's earliest experiments with a republican form of government, however brief and however narrowly circumscribed by its own desperate wartime circumstances. That experiment would ultimately prove to be. Within the newly formed Ezokyo Wakoku's leadership structure, Hijikata Toshizo received formal appointment as Rikugun Bugyo-nami, a senior army command position that placed him among the Republic's most important military leaders. Serving under Otori Keisuke, another former shogunate military officer who held overall army command, within a governing structure headed, as its elected president, by Enomoto Takeaki himself. This account has already suggested in its earlier sections that Hijikata's transformation over the preceding 5 years, from the youngest son of a farming family with no land to inherit, through his role as the Shinsengumi's severe internal disciplinarian, and now to a senior military commander within an actual, if short-lived, Republican government, represents one of this entire chronicle's more genuinely remarkable individual trajectories. Men who had once looked down on a farmer's son from outside Edo, career naval officers and former shogunate military professionals with considerably more elevated formal backgrounds than Hijikata himself possessed, now served alongside him, and in several documented cases under his direct command, having come, through hard-won experience over these final desperate months, to genuinely respect the same organizational discipline and the same battlefield competence that had once made him so feared and so effective within the Shinsengumi's own internal ranks. Hijikata's specific military responsibilities within the Ezokyo-Wakoku's defense involved overseeing key defensive positions, guarding the approaches to Hakodate and to Goryokaku itself. A responsibility that would, over the following months, require him to coordinate the defense not merely of his own former Shinsengumi contingent, now a comparatively small element within the much larger Republican army, but of the entire, genuinely diverse coalition of forces that Enomoto's government had assembled. Former shogunate infantry trained along modernized Western lines, naval officers and sailors more accustomed to service at sea than to land combat, and scattered remnants of loyalist forces from domains across the country whose own organized structures had, by this point in the broader war, largely dissolved. This account wants to note something it believes deserves genuine emphasis here. Hijikata, over these final months, appears to have grown into a considerably more broadly capable military leader than the narrower role he had occupied within the Shinsengumi's own internal structure had ever previously required or revealed. The severe internal disciplinarian who had enforced the Kyokuchu Hatto's uncompromising standards against comrades, and even against personal friends, had become, by the winter of 1868 and into 1869, a commander whose judgment other genuinely experienced military professionals had come to trust and to follow. A transformation that several surviving accounts from officers who served alongside him during this final period describe in terms of genuine, and evidently well-earned, professional respect. The imperial government, meanwhile, watching the Ezokyo-Wakoku's formation with considerable alarm, spent the winter months of 1868 into 1869 preparing a comprehensive military response intended to eliminate this final remaining pocket of organized resistance entirely, gathering naval and land forces that would, come spring, dwarf whatever defensive capability even a genuinely well-led coalition like Enomoto's Republic could realistically hope to withstand. Hijikata and the men serving under him spent these same winter months strengthening their own defensive positions, training and preparing, with what this account believes the surviving evidence suggests was a clear-eyed, largely unsentimental understanding of just how difficult the coming spring campaign was likely to prove. Before the imperial government's main spring offensive arrived, the Ezokyo-Wakoku's leadership attempted a bold, and ultimately unsuccessful, preemptive strike intended to disrupt the Imperial Navy's own preparations. An engagement worth describing in some detail, because it illustrates both the genuine tactical creativity this final phase of the war produced, and the increasingly steep technological disadvantage the Republic's forces faced. In the third month of 1869, as Imperial naval forces gathered at Miyako Bay, on the northeastern coast of the main island, preparing for their eventual assault on Ezo, Inomoto's naval command organized a daring raid intended to seize or disable the Imperial Navy's most modern warship, a vessel called the Cortets, which represented, at the time, one of the most advanced ironclad warships in East Asian waters, and whose potential deployment against the Republic's own comparatively modest naval forces represented a genuinely serious strategic threat. The raid, remembered as the Miyako Kaisen, the Battle of Miyako Bay, involved an attempt to board and seize the Cortets directly, using ships flying false flags to approach the Imperial fleet without immediately triggering alarm. A tactic that achieved initial surprise but ultimately failed once Imperial forces recognized the deception and responded with the Cortets' own considerable firepower. Alongside difficulties the attacking force encountered coordinating the actual boarding action once alongside their target. The raid's failure cost the Republic several of its own more experienced naval officers and further depleted its already limited naval resources, without achieving its intended objective of neutralizing the Imperial Navy's most dangerous single asset. This account mentions this engagement not because Hijikata himself played a direct personal role in the naval action, which fell primarily under Inomoto's own naval command rather than Hijikata's land-based responsibilities, but because it illustrates with particular clarity the broader technological gap this account has already discussed at some length in its earlier sections. A coalition built substantially around the same swordsmanship-centered martial tradition that had once made the Shinsengumi so feared in Kyoto's own narrow streets, now attempting, with real courage and real tactical creativity, to compete against opponents whose modern ironclad warships represented a category of military technology that no amount of individual skill or individual bravery could realistically overcome through direct confrontation alone. The failed raid at Miyako Bay left the Imperial Navy's own preparations for its main spring offensive against Ezo essentially undisturbed, and by the fourth month of 1869, that offensive was ready to begin in earnest, bringing with it the final, decisive campaign that would determine, within a matter of weeks, both the Ezekyo Wakaku's own fate and, with it, the actual final chapter of Hijikata Toshizo's own remarkable life. The Imperial government's spring offensive against Ezo began with landings on the island's coast in the fourth month of 1869. Imperial forces coming ashore at multiple points and advancing steadily toward the Republic's core defensive positions surrounding Hakodate and Goryokaku itself. A campaign considerably better resourced and considerably more methodically executed than the Republic's own hastily assembled defences could realistically withstand over any extended period. Among the most significant engagements of this campaign was the battle fought at Futamataguchi, a mountain pass position that Hijikata Toshizo himself directed the defence of, commanding a comparatively small force against a considerably larger imperial contingent attempting to force its way through the pass toward the Republic's remaining territory. This engagement, fought over several days in the fourth month of 1869, is remembered as one of Hijikata's own most genuinely impressive tactical achievements across his entire military career, using the pass's narrow, defensible terrain to offset his own numerical disadvantage, and employing modern rifle tactics with a sophistication that several later military historians have specifically praised. Hijikata's forces held their position and inflicted disproportionate casualties on the attacking imperial troops. A genuine tactical success that, however, could not, on its own, reverse the broader strategic trajectory of a campaign in which the Republic's forces were being steadily worn down and steadily pushed back across nearly every other sector of the island. This account finds something worth specifically noting in Hijikata's performance at Futamataguchi, because it represents, in this chronicle's own assessment, the clearest possible demonstration of just how far he had genuinely grown as a military commander since his earliest days as the Shinsengumi's severe internal disciplinarian. The tactical sophistication he displayed at Futamataguchi, adapting his forces' deployment specifically to counter his opponent's own modern equipment and modern tactics, rather than relying on the same close-quarters swordsmanship that had defined the organization's earlier engagements, suggests a man who had genuinely absorbed the hard lessons of Toba Fushimi and of the broader pattern of shogunate loyalist defeats this account has traced across its fourth part, and who had adapted with real intellectual seriousness to the actual demands of the modernizing warfare that was, by 1869, simply the reality any effective commander needed to operate within. Despite this tactical success, the broader strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Imperial forces, advancing on multiple fronts simultaneously, gradually compressed the Ezokyo Wakoku's defensive perimeter, and by the middle of the fifth month of 1869, the Republic's remaining forces had been pushed back into Hakodate itself and the immediate vicinity of Goryokaku, with Imperial naval forces now operating with the corvettes and other ships this account's previous section has already described, providing devastating supporting bombardment against the Republic's remaining coastal defensive positions. It was in this final, increasingly desperate phase of the campaign, with the Republic's defensive perimeter collapsing under sustained imperial pressure from land and sea alike, that Hijikata Toshizo, who had survived every major engagement of the Shinsengumi's entire 5-year existence, who had outlived Kondo Isami, Okita Soji, and so many of the other men whose stories this account has followed since its very first section, met his own end on a spring morning that this account's next section must now describe with the same careful, unflinching attention it has tried to bring to every death this long chronicle has already recorded. On the 11th day of the 5th month, 1869, with Imperial forces pressing their assault directly against Hakodate itself, Hijikata Toshizo led a counterattack intended to relieve pressure on a defensive position near the town's central district, riding at the front of his own men rather than directing the engagement from a position of greater personal safety. A choice consistent with everything this account has already established about his character across the preceding years of this chronicle. He was struck by gunfire during this counterattack, according to the most reliable surviving accounts, a bullet to the abdomen, and died, essentially immediately, on the battlefield. Still astride his horse by some accounts, or having fallen from it by others. The precise, final physical details varying somewhat across the different contemporary and near-contemporary sources that have preserved this moment for history. He was 34 years old. He had lived to see the entire arc of the Shinsengumi's existence, from its uncertain beginnings as a leftover handful of provincial swordsmen settling into a farming village on Kyoto's edge, through its years as one of the shogunate's most feared and most effective instruments, through the organization's own internal violence against Serizawa Kamo, Sannan Keisuke, and Ito Kashitaro, through the collapse of everything the organization had been built to serve, and into a final, genuinely hopeless defense of a cause that had, by any realistic practical measure, already been lost for well over a year by the time he finally fell. He did not surrender, and he did not, in the end, take his own life through the ritual method his own organization's code had once prescribed with such uncompromising severity for so many others across the preceding 6 years. He died the way an increasing number of soldiers in this new, modernizing military age were coming to die, cut down by rifle fire in open combat, a death that belonged, in its specific physical mechanism, considerably more to the future than to the past, even as the cause he died defending belonged, by 1869, entirely and irretrievably to a past that had already, in every meaningful practical sense, ended. Whether Hijikata himself, in his final conscious moments, registered anything of this particular irony, this account has no way of knowing, and, in keeping with its established commitment throughout this entire chronicle, will not pretend otherwise. What the surviving record does allow this account to say, with genuine confidence, is this. A man who had begun his life as an unwanted youngest son with no land to inherit, who had built, through sheer organisational discipline and hard-won personal competence, one of the most feared and most effective military organisations of his entire era, held to the code he had spent his adult life constructing, and to the men who still followed him, until there was, quite literally, nothing left to hold on to but the ground beneath him when he finally fell. News of Hijikata's death spread quickly through the remaining Republic's defensive forces, and, by several accounts, contributed directly to a rapid collapse in morale among troops who had, whatever the broader strategic hopelessness of their position, continued fighting in no small part because of the specific confidence his own steady, experienced leadership had continued to inspire even through the campaign's most difficult final weeks. Within days of his death, resistance around Hakodate itself effectively collapsed, leaving only Goryokaku and its immediate surroundings still under the Republic's nominal control. A final holdout that would not, itself, last very much longer. With Hijikata Toshizo dead and Hakodate itself lost, the remaining Ezokyo Wakoku forces withdrew into Goryokaku itself, where Enomoto Takeaki and the Republic's remaining leadership faced the same essential question that shogunate loyalists across the country had already confronted, in one form or another, over the preceding 18 months. Whether to continue a resistance that had become, by any objective military assessment, entirely without realistic hope of success, or to accept the surrender terms the imperial government had, by this point in the broader war, become genuinely practiced at offering. The fortress endured several additional days of naval and artillery bombardment, imperial forces having by this point achieved essentially complete naval and land superiority across the entire island, before Enomoto, on the 18th day of the 5th month, 1869, formally surrendered, bringing the Ezokyo Wakaku's brief existence and, with it, the last organised shogunate loyalist resistance anywhere in Japan, to its official conclusion. This surrender marked, in the most direct and unambiguous sense available, the actual formal end of the Boshin Senso, the Boshin War, this account's fourth part first introduced. A conflict that had begun roughly 16 months earlier, with the opening exchange of gunfire on the roads near Toba and Fushimi, and that concluded at Goryokaku with the surrender of a hastily organised republican government whose own existence, brief and improbable as it ultimately proved, nonetheless represents, in the assessment of many historians who have studied this period, a genuinely significant, if largely unrealised, moment of political experimentation within Japan's broader 19th century transformation. Saito Hajime, who had made his way north from Aizu's own surrender the previous autumn and had continued fighting alongside the Republic's remaining forces through this final campaign, survived the surrender at Goryokaku, along with a number of other former Shinsengumi members whose specific individual fates the surviving historical record does not always allow this account to trace with full precision. Following the formal surrender, surviving loyalist officers and soldiers were generally taken into custody by the imperial government, processed according to policies that this account has already noted in its discussion of Aizu's own post-war treatment, varied considerably in their severity depending on the specific individual's perceived level of responsibility and the specific political calculations of the officials handling each case. Saito himself, following a period of formal detention, was eventually released, and it is from this point in his own personal story that this account can begin tracing the considerably longer and considerably more peaceful remainder of his life. A life that would carry him, in the decades that followed, into service within the very kind of new imperial institutions his younger self had spent 5 years fighting against. A transformation this account's following sections will need to describe in some detail. because it represents one of this entire chronicle's more genuinely striking illustrations of just how completely and how quickly the Japan these men had fought so hard over would go on to reshape itself, and its own relationship to the men who had once opposed that reshaping with everything they had. Saito Hajime's life, following his release from imperial custody, took a trajectory that this account believes deserves careful, unhurried attention, because it illustrates something genuinely important about how completely Japan's political landscape reorganized itself in the years following the Boshin War's conclusion, and about the particular kind of pragmatic adaptation that even former shogunate loyalists, given time, often proved capable of. Saito settled, in the years following his release, in the Aizu region itself, or in territory closely connected to it, eventually taking a new name, Fujitagoro, a practice this account has already noted was not uncommon among former shogunate loyalists seeking to establish new lives within a political order that had, in its earliest years, remained genuinely uncertain about how thoroughly it intended to punish or to forgive its former enemies. He married in the 1870s a woman connected to a former Aizu retainer family, a union that several accounts suggest carried genuine personal significance beyond simple practical convenience, reflecting Saito's own continued connection to the Aizu community whose cause he had chosen. This account's earlier sections have already described to bind his own personal loyalty to so specifically during the war's final desperate year. Perhaps the single most striking development in Saito's post-war life, and the detail this account finds most worth dwelling on, is his eventual service within the new imperial government's own police apparatus. He joined the newly organized Keisho, Tokyo's metropolitan police force, in the 1870s, serving for a period during the Seinan Senso, the Southwest War of 1877, a major rebellion led by Saigo Takamori, one of the very Satsuma leaders whose own domain's forces Saito had once fought against at Toba Fushimi and throughout the broader Boshin War. This account wants to sit, briefly, with the genuine strangeness of this development. Saito, a man who had spent 5 years as one of the Shinsengumi's most capable and most loyal swordsmen, fighting specifically against the political forces that Satsuma and Choshu's alliance represented, spent a portion of his later career serving the very government those same forces had built, helping suppress a rebellion led by one of that government's own founding figures, who had himself, by 1877, fallen out with the political order he had helped create. Whether Saito experienced any particular irony or any particular internal conflict in this later service, the surviving record does not clearly indicate, and this account, consistent with its established practice throughout this entire chronicle, will not invent an interior emotional life for him that the sources themselves do not support. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Saito, unlike Kondo and Hijikata, proved capable of the kind of pragmatic accommodation with the new political order that allowed him to build a genuinely long and, by most accounts, genuinely stable later life, continuing in various forms of government and educational service into his final years. Saito Hajime, under his adopted name Fujitagoro, died in 1915, at the age of approximately 72, having outlived nearly every other major figure this account has followed across its entire chronicle. Kondo and Okita by nearly half a century. Hijikata by well over 4 decades. He is remembered by the small number of later accounts that specifically sought out and preserved details of his post-war life, as a man of quiet, disciplined bearing who spoke rarely and without excessive drama about his Shinsengumi years, treating that chapter of his life, by every indication available, as simply one part, however dramatic, of a considerably longer and considerably more varied existence than the violent years of his early 20s might, on their own, have suggested was available to him. This account must now return, for what will be close to the final time in this long chronicle, to the man whose own late-life reminiscence opened this entire account in its very first section, Nagakura Shinpachi, whose personal trajectory following the Boshin War's conclusion carried him, eventually, to the quiet room in Otaru, where this account first found him, watching snow fall on a winter evening near the close of the 19th century. Nagakura, following his split from Kondo during the Shinsengumi's final desperate months and his subsequent service commanding Seihei Tai alongside Harada Sanosuke, survived the Boshin War's conclusion and, in the years that followed, pursued a path considerably less dramatic and considerably longer than the violent years of his 20s might have suggested awaited him. He continued for a period teaching swordsmanship, the discipline that had defined his entire adult life since his earliest days training alongside Kondo at the Shiekan, eventually settling for an extended period in the Matsumai domain, connected to his own original family background, before eventually making his way further north still, to Otaru, on Hokkaido's coast. Not far in the broader geography of the island from the fortress at Goryokaku, where Hijikata Toshizo had fallen decades earlier. It was in these final decades of his life that Nagakura married into the Sugimura family, taking the name Sugimura Yoshie. This account's very first section has already introduced. And it was under this name, rather than under the Shinsengumi identity that had defined his most famous years, that he lived out the greater portion of his long later life. A life that, this account wants to note, spanned an almost unimaginable degree of transformation in the country around him, from the rigid, hereditary, sword-carrying world of his own youth to a rapidly industrializing nation building railways, adopting Western dress and Western political institutions, and preparing, by the early 20th century, to take its place among the major powers of the wider world. It was in his final years, well into his 60s, that Nagakura agreed to sit for a series of interviews, published serially in a local newspaper, the Otaru Shimbun, dictating his own detailed recollections of the Shinsengumi's history, from the earliest days at the Shiekan, through the Ikadaya raid, through the organization's internal purges and its final catastrophic collapse, providing, in the process, one of the single most unavailable surviving primary sources for understanding this entire story from the perspective of a man who had actually lived it, rather than reconstructed it from later, more distant documentary evidence. This account has drawn on Nagakura's own testimony, whether directly or through the broader body of historical scholarship that has itself drawn on his recollections, throughout nearly every section of this entire chronicle. And it wants to specifically acknowledge, here, near this account's own conclusion, the genuine debt this entire project owes to a man who chose, in his final years, to preserve a story that might otherwise have faded, along with the rest of his generation's own first-hand memory, into the considerably thinner and considerably less textured record that pure documentary evidence alone could have provided. Nagakura Shinpachi died in 1915, the same year as Saito Hajime, at the age of 77, having lived long enough to see the entire arc of Meiji Japan's transformation, from the rigid feudal order of his own youth through a modernizing, industrializing nation that had, by the year of his death, already fought and won 2 major international wars and stood, by any reasonable contemporary assessment, among the recognized great powers of the early 20th century world. A transformation that the young swordsman who had once burst into a crowded inn on a hot July night in 1864, uncertain whether he would live to see morning, could scarcely have imagined lay ahead of the country he had once fought so hard and so violently to preserve in its older, considerably more rigid form. By the time Goryokaku surrendered in the summer of 1869, bringing the Boshin War to its formal conclusion, the new Meiji government had already begun the sweeping process of institutional transformation that would, within less than a decade, dismantle almost entirely the social and political order the Shinsengumi had spent 6 years fighting to preserve. The domains themselves, the semi-autonomous territories that had structured Japanese political geography for centuries, were formally abolished in 1871 and replaced with a system of centrally administered prefectures, ending in a single administrative stroke the specific territorial and political structure that had once given men like Matsudaira Katamori their own domain's independent authority to sponsor an organization like the Shinsengumi in the first place. The formal legal distinctions between samurai and commoner status, distinctions that Kondo Isami had spent his entire adult life working to cross, first through relentless swordsmanship training and eventually through actual formal appointment to Hatamoto rank, were gradually dissolved over the following several years, as the new government pursued a broader policy of legal and social equality intended to mobilize the country's full population, rather than merely its hereditary warrior class, in service of rapid national modernization. And in 1876, less than a decade after Hijikata Toshizo fell in the fighting near Hakodate, the government issued a formal edict banning the public wearing of swords entirely, the Haitore, ending, in a single stroke of policy, a visible tradition that had defined the samurai class and had defined so much of this entire chronicle's own violent narrative for centuries. It is worth sitting briefly with the sheer speed of this transformation. Kondo, who died in 1868, still believing, or at minimum still acting as though he believed, that he was defending a durable and fundamentally legitimate political order, had died only 8 years before that order's single most visible and most symbolically significant marker, the sword worn openly at a man's side, was simply outlawed by the very government that had replaced the one he had given his life defending. The Japan that emerged from this period of rapid transformation became, within a single generation, something that would have been genuinely difficult for Kondo or Hijikata to fully recognize. A rapidly modernizing nation, building railways and factories, adopting Western military organization and Western industrial techniques, sending students abroad for foreign study, and, by the first years of the 20th century, transforming itself from a closed, feudal society into an industrial and military power capable of defeating a major European empire in open warfare. A transformation that Nagakura Shinpachi, this account's previous section has already noted, lived to see, essentially, in full. None of this transformation happened because of the Shinsengumi, and much of it happened, in its broadest outlines, despite everything the organisation had fought to prevent. And yet it is worth asking, as this account approaches its own conclusion, whether their resistance, however ultimately doomed, was therefore entirely without meaning. And the most honest answer this account can offer, given without excessive sentiment, is probably not entirely no. The specific form Japan's modernisation ultimately took, the particular balance it eventually struck between wholesale adoption of foreign methods and continued preservation of its own distinct institutions and cultural identity, was shaped in some genuine part by the fact that this transition had been contested, had required real argument and real sacrifice on multiple sides of a genuinely difficult national question, rather than simply being imposed on a population offering no resistance whatsoever. The men who died at Toba Fushimi, at Aizu, and at Goryokaku did not, in any direct sense, prevent the new Japan from being built. But their resistance was itself part of the larger, genuinely contested process through which that new Japan came to understand, with real and hard-won clarity, exactly what it was choosing to become, and exactly what it was choosing to leave behind. This account opened, in its very first section, with an old man sitting by a window in Otaru, watching snow fall on a winter evening, thinking of comrades who had not lived to grow old alongside him. It is worth returning to that image now, at this chronicle's actual close, because everything this long account has described since that opening scene has, in some sense, simply been an answer to the question that old man's own quiet reflection first posed. What actually happened across those 5 extraordinary years to the friends he was remembering? Kondo Isami died at 44, executed as a common criminal for the specific crime of having kept his word past the point where keeping it made any remaining practical sense, in a political world that had already, by the time of his death, moved decisively beyond the older understanding of loyalty and legitimacy his entire life had been organized around. Hijikata Toshizo died at 34, shot from his horse in the fighting near Hakodate, at the very edge of the country he had spent his entire adult life trying, in his own particular and often severe way, to serve. Having carried a code he had largely built himself, all the way to a conclusion he must, by that final spring, have understood with genuine clarity was coming. Okita Soji died at perhaps 25, not from any sword or any bullet, but from an illness that had likely first announced itself during his single most famous night of fighting, watching, in his final weeks of life, a cat cross a quiet garden, taking whatever small, ordinary pleasure remained available to a body that had once been capable of the most extraordinary things. Saito Hajime and Nagakura Shinpachi lived on, each in his own way, into the 20th century, carrying the story forward. Saito through a life of quiet, disciplined public service that eventually placed him in one of this entire chronicle's more striking ironies, in the employ of the very government his younger self had fought against, and Nagakura through the patient, deliberate work of preserving, in his own words, for a newspaper audience in a small northern port town, the detailed memory of everything this account has spent 4 parts describing. They were, none of them, born to greatness in the way that word was traditionally understood within the rigid social order these men grew up inside. They were a farmer's adopted son, a farmer's unwanted youngest child, a low-ranking samurai family's frail young son, raised almost from infancy inside a rural dojo's practice hall, and a restless young man who left his own more comfortable samurai household to go looking, quite deliberately, for exactly the kind of demanding, uncertain life that eventually found him. They became, for a handful of genuinely extraordinary years, some of the most feared, most talked about, and most consequential men in the entire country. Not because history simply handed them that position, but because they built it themselves, out of nothing more than relentless discipline, real and hard-won skill, and an old-fashioned, increasingly unfashionable insistence that a promise, once given, was not a thing to be casually revisited simply because the surrounding political world had changed around it. The world did change, far more completely and far more quickly than any of them could have reasonably anticipated on that ordinary spring morning in 1863 when they first set out from Edo along the Tokaido Road. It left several of them behind, in the most final and most irreversible sense, the way history eventually leaves behind nearly everyone who commits everything they have to a particular, contested vision of how the future ought to look. But it did not erase them. If anything, the considerable passage of time since these events, now approaching 2 centuries, has done something closer to the opposite, gradually softening the sharper edges of what was, in its own actual historical moment, a genuinely violent, genuinely divisive, and genuinely morally complicated chapter of Japanese history, and leaving behind, for those willing to look closely and honestly at what actually happened, something closer to what this account has tried, across its 4 parts, to offer. A careful, unhurried, and unflinching accounting of a small group of ordinary men who found themselves, for a handful of extraordinary years, near the very centre of their country's most consequential transformation. and who met that transformation, for better and for considerably worse, with everything they actually had. The rice is still planted each spring in the fields outside what used to be called Edo, in the fields around Hino where Hijikata was born, in the fields that Kondo and Okita and all the rest of them once walked past on their way toward a future none of them could have properly imagined on that ordinary morning in 1863, when the whole of this long story was still entirely ahead of them, and none of it, not yet, had actually happened at all. The character they once flew above their heads, Makoto, sincerity, outlasted the organization that carried it, outlasted the political cause it was meant to serve, and outlasted, in the end, nearly every one of the men who once marched beneath it. It survives now only in the telling, passed from Nagakuro's own careful, late-life testimony through generations of historians and storytellers, down to this particular account, offered here, in as honest and as complete a form as the surviving evidence allows, so that these men, whatever else might reasonably be said about the cause they gave their lives to, might at least be remembered as what they actually were. Young men, mostly, doing the very best they knew how to do, inside a world that was ending faster than any of them could possibly have understood.